Test, test.
Yep, I hear it inside.
Okay, now I think we're on. You hear us now? Okay.
Alrighty, well, good afternoon. Welcome. I see many familiar faces and some new ones as well. So welcome to the Niskayuna Reformed Church, to this Sacred Sites 2023 event. We're blessed that you're here, and we want to welcome you not just to this event, but to any and every Sunday you'd like to join us for worship here at 9:30 a.m. Please come and join us. My name is Reverend Michael Meyerveen. I'm the co-pastor of the Schoharie Reformed, oh my gosh, that's where we used to be. I said that for 20 years. I only have a few months of this one. So, co-pastor of the Niskayuna Reformed Church. So we just want to welcome you, and that is as of October of this past year. So I'll let you introduce yourself, and you can say it right. Thank you.
See, the conversation just messed him up.
It did.
And I am, as Mike likes to say, Reverend Doctor. Sherry's just fine. Sherry Meyerveen, also co-pastor of the Niskayuna Reformed Church and minister for renewal for the Regional Synod of Albany. So I get to do stuff here and do stuff with the rest of the churches in upstate New York, and encourage them to continue to make a difference in their communities, which is a little bit of what we are to talk about.
Yeah, so as we celebrate this day and begin our time together, wondering a little bit more about the role of congregations and communities in that and the legacy of faithfulness that we're all a part of, I just want to invite us to open in a word of prayer, if we may. Let's pray together. Gracious God, thank you for the beauty of this day. Thank you for the legacy of faith and faithfulness from you, with you, in this place, by the many generations who've come before us as your people, serving and living life in this community to us today, here in this place. It is a sign and a symbol of your faithfulness to us, and we are grateful for that, and we come celebrating that and seeking your faithfulness here and now and into the future. In your name we pray, amen. Well, as we celebrate this day together, and as we think about a little more this role of congregations and communities, I'm reminded of a story. You may have heard the story before, but it's one I really think speaks well to the role of churches in communities. And it's the story of two farmers, adjoining brothers, who had adjoining farms that fell into conflict. And it was the first serious rift in 40 years of farming side by side, sharing machinery, trading labor, goods as needed without a hitch. And then this long collaboration fell into disrepair, fell apart, and it began with a small misunderstanding, and it grew into a major difference, and finally it exploded into exchange of bitter words, followed by weeks of silence. Until one morning, when there was a knock at the older brother's door, he opened it to find a man with a carpenter's toolbox. He said, "I'm looking for a few days of work," he said. "Perhaps you have a few small jobs that here and there. Could I be of help to you?" "Yes," said the older brother, "I do have a job for you. Look across the creek at that farm. That's my neighbor. In fact, it's my to the river levee and drug it out, and now there's a creek between us. Well, he may have done this to spite me, but I'll go him one better. See this pile of lumber currying by the barn? I want you to build me a fence. An 8-foot fence, so I won't need to see his face or his place anymore. Cool him down anyhow." The carpenter said, "I think I understand the situation. Show me the nails and the post hole digger, and I'll be able to do a job that pleases you." The older brother had to go to town for supplies, so he helped the carpenter get the materials ready, and then he was off for the day. The carpenter worked hard all day, measuring, sawing, and nailing. About sunset, when the farmer returned, the carpenter had just finished his job. The farmer's eyes opened wide, his jaw dropped. There was no fence there at all. It was a bridge stretching from one side of the creek to the other. A fine piece of work, handrails and all, and the neighbor, his younger brother, was coming across, his hand outstretched. "You are quite a fellow to build this bridge after all I've said and done." The two brothers stood at each end of the bridge, and then they met in the middle, taking each other's hand. They turned to see the carpenter hoist his toolbox on his shoulder. "No, wait, stay a few days. I have a lot of other projects for you," said the older brother. "I'd love to stay," said the carpenter, "but I have many more bridges to build." When I think about the role of the church, the congregation in community, I think one of the strongest images is that role of being a builder of bridges. Bridges from congregations into communities, from communities into the larger world. Bridges of hope, of healing, and of wholeness. It reminds me of the words that the prophet Isaiah speaks to God's people in Isaiah 58, when he says this to the people: "If you do away with the yoke of oppression, with the pointing finger and malicious talk, and if you spend yourselves in behalf of the hungry and satisfy the needs of the oppressed, then your light will rise in the darkness, and your night will become like the noonday. The Lord will guide you always. God will satisfy your needs in a sun-scorched land and will strengthen your frame. You will be like a well-watered garden, like a spring whose waters never fail. Your people will rebuild the ancient ruins and will raise up the age-old foundations. You will be called repairer of broken walls, restorer of streets with dwellings." Building bridges, raising up, restoring, repairing. I think this is some of the strongest and most wonderful images that God gives us as congregations in communities. To think about ways we can do this. And in that language I hear the calling of the church to do away with so many of the patterns of the world that are about oppression, that are about blame, that are about maliciousness, that are about suspicion. And instead, God is calling us to restore the concept of neighbor. Neighbor as people to care for, to learn with, to grow alongside of. Neighbor in the community, to restore that relationship. To see our goods, our resources as gifts to be shared in generosity, in love for the good of the whole, rather than the security of the few. And to think about again this God hope-filled message of restoring buildings and communities and places and dwellings, of being well-watered gardens. This image is one of the strongest ones to me that speaks of congregations and communities. So I just want to invite us, as we hear today of the stories, as we hear the connecting places, where do we hear in our own lives, in our own places, whatever our places of worship may be? How is God inviting us? And how has God done so in the past? Built bridges, repaired, restored, lifted up us into people and communities for the good of God and the good of the world. We're going to invite you to close with this blessing. Sherry's going to read this blessing from Jan Richardson entitled Sanctuary.
My turn to preach this morning, and so we used a Jan Richardson poem then, so we'll use another one this time as we talk about. And the one thing I'm going to augment about what you said is that you keep talking about church and congregation. So we're talking about sacred space, and this is a space where we gather. So in the Protestant and Reformed, and actually Roman Catholic as well, the church is the people. And so when we talk about church and community, we're reminded that it is, we gather here in this place, which is important for us to have a place to gather, but it is meant as a place where we are brought together, reminded of who we are, so that we, the church, go live in the world. A blessing called sanctuary. You hardly knew how hungry you were to be gathered in, to receive the welcome that invited you to enter entirely. Nothing of you found foreign or strange, nothing of your life that you were asked to leave behind or to carry in silence or in shame. Tentative steps became settling in, leaning into the blessing that unfolded you, taking your place in the circle that stunned you with its unimagined grace. You began to breathe again, to move without fear, to speak with abandon the words you carried in your bones that echoed in your being. You learned to sing. But the deal with this blessing is that it will not leave you alone, will not let you linger in safety, in stasis. The time will come when this blessing will ask you to leave, not because it has tired of you, but because it desires for you to become the sanctuary that you have found, to speak your word into the world, to let what you have heard with your own ears, seen with your own eyes, known in your own heart, that you are beloved, precious child of God, beautiful to behold, and you are welcome and more than welcome here. Thank you.
Got it. This takes a while to warm up, so in the meantime, I'll introduce myself since I don't trust anyone else to do it. I'm Norm Tullier. I'm an RCA pastor. I serve the Queens and New Baltimore Reformed Churches and the Community Reformed Church of Colony. And after that, I worked for the Reformed Church in America as coordinator of gift planning. And people would, on airplane, I've traveled all of North America, and people would ask me what I did on the airplane, and I would say, well, I can show you how to give your money away. That took care of any conversation. So anyway, they asked the old person to do the old stuff here. So I'm going to talk about some history and so on. Start with, we're going to talk about, first of all, where the RCA came from, Reformed Church in America, not of America. Reformed Church in America came from, and also talk about how what we believe, what Reformed theology is, and then how Reformed theology makes a difference in how we worship and should make a difference in church architecture. So that's where we're headed with this. So where did the Reformed Church in America come from? Well, it comes out of the 16th century Reformation. Everybody's heard about Martin Luther putting his theses on the wall and discussion and so forth. Well, that's kind of started things going. And then his ideas, especially justification by faith, spread to many different areas of Europe, and especially into Switzerland, which was the home of John Calvin. And John Calvin put together what we call a systematic theology. That means it was all laid out in a kind of a system. And his Institutes of the Christian Religion was first published in 1536. It's now a 2-volume work, or more, and it's hard to read, to say the least. This theology that came to be called Reformed, and you notice, and unfortunately it didn't come out right here, but as in the church, formed, that what the Reformers believed is that the church that had been there, what we'd call the Catholic Church, that had become corrupted and not doing things the proper ways and so on. But their new theology that they put together, in that respect, they said they had formed again the church, reformed the church. And that theology came to be known as Reformed theology. The Reformed tradition spread to many parts of the Europe. To this day, there's the Hungarian Reformed Church, French Reformed Church, a German Reformed Church. There's even a Reformed church in Scotland, but it's called the Presbyterian Church. It's called that because they do it by their system of government rather than their theology. This congregation is Reformed but has a Presbyterian system of government. That simply means representative, which, by the way, pretty much the United States government is patterned after. So it did spread. The Netherlands espoused it, spread it to many parts of the world, and as a result, when the Dutch first came to America, and we always hear about the Pilgrims, but we were here first. We settled, well, actually, Jamestown was a little earlier, but we settled Albany in who knows what year? 1614. 1614, the Dutch began to settle in Albany. And the Reformed tradition came with the Dutch settlers. And in fact, one of the things that they did is they tried to provide spiritual guidance and help to the settlers who came here. And so does it work? There it is. We claim to be the oldest Protestant church in America with a continuous history, since there's always been a Dutch Reformed church here since 1628. First minister came to what's now New York City, was then New Amsterdam, and that church continues. That's what we call the collegiate church in New York City. These days it has 4 or 5 different congregations. You've probably all heard of Marble Collegiate Church. That's one of them. And so that church continues, and they own a lot of property in Manhattan. So anyway, there's always been a Dutch Reformed church minister here. However, we split from the Dutch church in 1819. That's after the Revolutionary War. And it became onerous to have to go back and forth to Amsterdam for ordination and things like that. And we became the Reformed Church. They probably called it the Dutch Reformed Church at that time. But then in 1867, the name was changed to the Reformed Church in America. People still call us the Dutch Reformed Church. If you want to know what church is in town, somebody will ask, is there a Dutch Reformed Church? Yeah. So what can I say? It's only been well over 100 years. So with that, we're going to talk about theology, liturgy, and architecture. Our theology shapes the way we worship and also how we erect our buildings. At least it did. You'll find my pet peeve here pretty soon. Reformed theology is often summarized in 3 words, and this is usually the 3 words that are used in one of our standards of faith, which is the Heidelberg Catechism. Those of you who were here this morning heard a question and answer. Sherry used one in her sermon this morning. The Heidelberg Catechism was put out first in 1563 in Heidelberg, Germany. It was under the direction of the Elector Frederick, who ordered them to make it. It was 2 men, Ursinus, and I can't remember the other one's name. They put it together, and it's been used ever since. When I was a pastor, we had a 2-year confirmation class for kids, and we studied the Heidelberg Catechism for 2 years. I don't know how well it took, but nonetheless. So it's often summarized in 3 words. First is guilt. And that simply is that we're not perfect people. And most of us know we're not perfect people. There are a few who think they are, but most of us realize that we are not perfect and that we do some things wrong. The second is grace. And this harks back again to Luther's theology, that we are justified by faith. It's not something we do ourselves, but that God works with us to make us part of God's kingdom. And so as a result of that, we are grateful. So we show gratitude by the way in which we live. That's basic, very basic Reformed theology. Now that issues in the way in which we worship. Some people think, well, you just go to church, you throw some stuff together, a few hymns and prayers and so on, and a long, long sermon, like Sherry goes on for hours and so forth. But there's a reason we do what we do. Most people are unaware of it, however. First of all, we come before God. And if you look in our bulletin, you'll see that it says we approach God. That's the first section of our liturgy. And in that section of the liturgy, we offer praise, we sing hymns, and so on. We confess that we are not perfect. We have a prayer of confession. We also are assured that we are forgiven, and that's a very important part of it. We not only confess that we are sinful people, but then we are assured that we are forgiven because we have confessed our sins. Then we go on to the second section, the middle section. And this is where we hear how we are forgiven. What is it that grants us this forgiveness? And so in that section, the scriptures are read. And my philosophy is that it should always be Old Testament, the letters from the New Testament, and the gospel. And those are the three sections of our New Testament scriptures that we should always be using, hearing the word. And so then we also, after that, the scriptures are interpreted. By definition, a sermon is an interpretation of scriptures. I've heard many that aren't, and you probably have too. But there's always should always be a scripture lesson upon which the sermon is based. Then the third section that we do is that we respond. We respond to God through part of our liturgy. That liturgy is by celebrating the sacraments. In the Reformed tradition, there are two sacraments, the Lord's Supper and baptism. And so we are to celebrate those. That's why we have the Lord's Supper in the third section. Now, some people move baptism to earlier simply because they don't want to have this kid crying through the whole service. But nonetheless, that's really where it belongs. We offer prayers for ourselves and for others. So we respond in prayer as well. We are urged to go into the world in service. And I think that I also forgot to put in here that we also respond by bringing our gifts. That's why that comes toward the end of the worship service, because it's a response where we bring our gifts of money, maybe our time and our talents as well. And then we are urged to go into the world in service, and we are blessed as we go out to serve. The benediction is a blessing upon the people. May the blessing of God Almighty, the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit be with you now and always, or something similar. So that's why we do these things in liturgy. They correspond to what our theology is, which is guilt, grace, and gratitude. Okay, that leads me to then, how do we design our buildings? If we go into Reformed architecture, the two things that we always talk about are word and sacrament. Now, the word is the scriptures, sacrament, baptism, and the Lord's Supper. And so, therefore, we have a pulpit, we have a baptismal font, and we have a communion table. It's not an altar, by the way. It's a communion table. And so, those are the parts of the worship service that are important to us. There's the, I'm getting beyond myself. Here's a picture of a church that you may recognize. Anybody know where that is? It's right here. Now you're going to hear my pet peeve. This church was redone in the 1930s, and they destroyed the Reformed architecture. Okay? A Reformed church would have a pulpit in the middle, as that one is, and it usually would have a communion table right here on the floor. And a baptismal font, they put that anywhere, but it ought to be back by the door. Because baptism is how we enter into the church. We become part of the church through baptism. So that's why if you go in a Catholic church, probably an Episcopal church, you end up walking around the baptismal font, because that's where it really belongs. And so the Reformed churches designed with a pulpit, a table, and a baptismal font, because that's what we believe. We believe in the Word, and we believe in the sacraments. Now, they didn't destroy it right away, because it was still like that in 1928. This is a little better picture. But you can see there's still a pulpit. I think they started adding choir pews on the sides by that time, and there's a communion table. And different pews from what we have now. Now, I actually like the white, but I'd be a lot happier if it was a white pulpit and a white table. And that's all. This is Episcopalian. So, and unfortunately, there's not a lot of Reformed churches went this route. It became the fad in the 1930s and 40s and 50s. So anyway, so our churches are designed according to our theology as well. We hear the word and we respond through the sacraments. I'm done.
Back to at least my first slide.
Yeah, I am.
That one up there.
Well, I'm going to do slideshow.
Oh, yeah, okay.
I think that's what you want.
Yep. And we'll go back. Come on. Back.
So you didn't want me to ask questions?
No.
Any questions?
Thank you.
The one that says power would probably help. Okay, there we go. So we're going to talk about, now that Norm has talked about the architecture and, well, the liturgy, we're going to talk about the buildings itself and sort of how this church has developed. Back in the 1970s, the president of New Brunswick Theological Seminary, the Reverend Howard Hageman, wrote that only a church which is conscious of its origin can have significant ideas about its destiny. I can't quite, you're going to have to forgive me as I reach through and do that. The Niskayuna Reformed Church, established in the middle of the 18th century to provide a spiritual and cultural center for the Dutch settlers who lived in this area between Albany and Schenectady, still serves a vital function in the community today. This present church structure we're in, built in 1852, is on the site of a previous church and is sort of a picture of a typical Greek revival period Protestant church derived from various kinds of New England models. History tells us little about the early settlement period in this area that's now Niskayuna, possibly because the area in general consists of poor clay and sand farmland out here, really except for the Mohawk River Flats pictured here. And it also tended to lack the water power that would encourage the development of mills. This area here at the confluence of the Mohawk and the Hudson Rivers was also isolated by the difficulty of river navigation between Schenectady and Cohoes and Albany, where the Great Cohoes Falls created a major difficulty to sort of flat water travel from the Hudson up into the Mohawk. And really the settlement at Schenectady remained the gateway to the west, with most of the goods destined to go to the west were transported overland from Albany until well after the opening of the Erie Canal in 1825. So this area was kind of bypassed. Geography kind of mitigated against the development of the area and the town of Niskayuna as a population center. However, there were fertile flats along the Mohawk River, which you have a picture here, and these were taken up by Dutch settlers reaching out from Albany at a very early date. Land records show that here by 1669, there was Jan Verbeck, Philip Peter Schuyler, and Peter Van Olinda had purchased land here in Niskayuna on the south side of the river, and other early settlers here were the Kloots, the Vedders, the Van Vrankens, Groats, Timesons, and Purses, names which, of course, fill up the cemetery now behind the church. One of the first maps here, the hamlet of Niskayuna, is marked on a 1756 map as a small cluster of houses adjacent to the river. This map shows a road pattern that was really derived from early Indian trails and trade routes. The original settlement at Albany was as a fur trading center. The Dutch were here not so much to colonize as to make money. There was, the fur trading here was a big business, and they were here to make money, not necessarily to, to develop and settle the land. On it here, the settlements of Albany and Schenectady are linked by a road, which later became the Albany-Schenectady Turnpike, and is now down there called the River Road. That's sort of the road that the houses are along. This was the road that, if you've read the poem about the Schenectady Massacre in February of 1690, when the French attacked and burned the settlement, the River Road was the road that Simon Skimmerhorn took that night in February to warn the settlers of Albany of the attack at Schenectady. Another road, later the Troy-Schenectady Turnpike, runs easterly from Schenectady along the river as far as the Niskayuna hamlet, and here it changes direction, veering southward towards Albany. Just east of the hamlet marked on the map here, there's a ferry that took traffic north across the river from about 1724 on. And so this little settlement of Niskayuna is connected to the neighboring settlements of Albany and Schenectady very early. It's, sort of halfway. By 1845, the Troy-Schenectady Railroad passed through the hamlet as well, along the path of the current bike hike trail down on the river. But by 1866, Niskayuna was still the only hamlet in the town of widely spaced farms. So in the 1860 census, there are only 760 people in the whole town of Niskayuna. So really, this part that I show you here, where you can see the Dutch Reformed Church right there on the Troy-Schenectady Turnpike, that little hamlet, that's about the only built-up part of the whole town. Because of the distance from the settlements at Albany and Schenectady, the early Dutch settlers here established a church of their own. And early records are lost, but a history of the church written in 1852 says that the first services were held about 1750 in a Gabat house, or a prayer house, that stood near the intersection of the present Rosendale and the River Roads. It was used for Sunday worship and served as a schoolhouse the rest of the week. And it probably appeared to look more or less like a barn. A new meeting house was built on the same spot about 1760 and was used until 1828. This is a picture of the restored Huguenot church in New Paltz, and this is about the only building I can tell that is what the church down there at the corner of Rosendale and River Road would have looked like. Early descriptions of it are as a square building with a four-sided roof running up to a point. Inside it had a gallery, a balcony on one side, opposite the pulpit, and was seated with raised benches along the wall for the men and benches on the floor in the middle for the women and the small children. A lot of people ask me why they had this division. The answer goes back to Calvin's writings. John Calvin believed that because it was Eve who was tempted by the snake in the Garden of Eden, that meant that women were inherently more susceptible to sin than men. And so that led in these early churches that the women sat in the center of the floor, surrounded by the men on the sides, because the women were inherently more susceptible to sin. Calvin thought that if the snake had tried to tempt Adam, he would have just sort of, stomped out and cut off its head and been done with it. So this was an idea that held through really until about the Revolution. And then it just kind of quietly disappeared, and everybody got to sit together in their pews. But this church had the separate seating and did until the new building was built up here in 1828. In those early days, the congregation was served by a number of itinerant ministers, including the Reverend Dirk Romine from Schenectady, who was one of the founders of Union College, and the Reverend Sampson Oakham, who was a Mohegan Indian from Connecticut, who had been one of the first students at Eliza Wheelock's Indian School, which is now Dartmouth University. Have sympathy for the poor ministers of those times, because the service was a 2-hour service in the morning. They would take an hour break for lunch, and there would be a 2-hour service in the afternoon, where the poor minister would have to come up with 2 hour-long sermons on different topics every Sunday. Once the Revolutionary War was over and the area became more settled and prosperous, this congregation was sufficiently large to want to call for a minister regularly. Accordingly, jointly with the Bout Reformed Church, which had been established in 1784 down the road to the east, this church called in November of 1790 the Reverend John Demarest, who stayed until 1801. By 1802, the part of the Niskayuna congregation that lived on the north side of the Mohawk River decided that they did not like to travel so far to church, and they separated off into their own meeting house called the Amity Reformed Church, which is still over there across the river in Fisher's Ferry. And the two churches continued to call pastors jointly until 1833. And it only recently occurred to me, well, the congregation decided it was too difficult to travel across the river, but they didn't mind making the minister go back and forth across the river 3 times on a Sunday. And there was only one ferry, so he had to take that in summer and winter. So too far for the congregation to travel, but not far enough for the minister. By 1827, Niskayuna Reformed Church decided they needed to replace the old 1760 building that was down the hill, and a site had been sought for a number of years, and the present location was purchased from Frederick Orloff in 1828. The congregation hired the Albany architect Philip Hooker to design a frame building on this site that was 50 by 65 feet. The pulpit was in between the doors. A gallery, a balcony extended on the sides and rear of the church, and there were 2 doors at the ends of the aisles opposite the pulpit with a window in between them. And that's what this shows right here. It will say that this is down here, the front, so that if you came late to church, you had to walk in and face the whole congregation before you could get to your seat. So this was a good, but plus in those days, the elders and the deacons sat up in front on either side of the pulpit so they could keep watch to make sure the congregation was not misbehaving. So it was a much more intimidating thing if you came in late. You couldn't just sneak in the back. Now, while Hooker's plans were exemplary, the builders they hired were not. There was a long series of disagreements and a lawsuit about the quality of the work of this wooden church, which wasn't resolved until 1830. The building stood a total of only 22 years. In 1851, this church called the Reverend Goyen Talmage. Though he was here only 4 years, it is said he did the work that very few could have done satisfactorily. Reverend Talmage found the congregation here too large, spread out now over a very wide area, and the church building disintegrating. By his influence, encouragement, and enthusiasm, he divided the congregation and left 2 solidly constructed houses of worship, this building here and the Leishakill Reformed Church over on Central Avenue. The cornerstone of the present church was laid on July 31st, 1852. The architect was George Nichols, who was a builder and carpenter born in Connecticut in 1812 and who migrated here to Watervliet around 1850. The mason was Aaron Kingsbury, who was also born in Connecticut around the same time, about 1807, and who lived in Schenectady at the time. The carpenter was Joseph Putman, who was a member of the congregation. Now, because Niskayuna is a place that was made up of frugal farmers, the new building reused a number of elements from the original 1828 Philip Hooker Church, including all of the doors on the second floor, the main roof framing members and trusses, the framing and sheathing of the bell tower, and the stairs that we use to get up to the second floor. Here in this, the arrows, you can notice there are some holes there. This is a view up in the attic. The holes there, and there are some other holes in those beams that are used as the roof support. Those are earlier mortises and holes for pegs for the way these timbers were then taken apart, recut to use for this church, and then whatever their connecting was for the previous way was left behind. So you can see that all this timber up in the attic was reused from the original church, because there's no point in cutting new stuff because it was still there. There are no photographs of what the original interior of this church looked like, but it was probably just as plain as the previous church and had the same layout of 2 aisles and 3 blocks of pew boxes, and probably used the original pulpit. In 1860, the congregation could finally afford a bell for the tower and purchased one from the Meneely Bell Foundry in West Troy for $440, for which they delivered it in the tower for that price. And then they installed an organ up in the gallery in 1869. However, the interior remained essentially unchanged until the pastorate of the Reverend Cornelius Ditmars, who came here in 1886 and who stayed for 46 years. Reverend Ditmar oversaw the first really major renovation of the interior of the church in 1888, which included changing the gallery. The original balcony just went flat across the back, and he changed it to this horseshoe shape. The pews were replaced, and they got rid of the boxed pews like you see in some Episcopal churches and replaced it with, the 2 aisles were changed to the presence center and the wall aisles. And they did a new modern Victorian paint design. I will point out in this view, the windows are still, at this point, still clear glass, which is one of the hallmarks of Dutch Reformed Church architecture. It's supposed to be big windows with clear glass because, of course, it lets the light of God shine in on the congregation. However, by 1888, there became this overwhelming fascination with stained glass, And so the clear windows in this church and Leishakil Church and a lot of other churches were taken out, and these stained glass windows were put in place. This decoration, this is one of the pictures that Norm showed you. It shows the decoration. He had the back of the church was flat in 1888 as a part of the renovations. They added the alcove in back where the new pulpit and the new altar furniture were. And there is just a very little bit left of that Victorian interior paintwork that you can see. The black and white photographs don't really convey just how sort of startling this interior was, because the church was probably just painted plain white beforehand. And so this sort of polychrome decoration must have been really pretty snazzy when it was new, and was very much, it's quite a backdrop for a minister there to speak at. He wants it back. There's a little bit of it left, but there's a lot of stuff back there behind now. So the other thing I get asked about a lot is the baptismal font over here, which is in memory of two sisters, Edith Cleveland, born in June 1879 and died in 1882, and her sister Bertha, born in September 1875 and died in 1882. The baptismal font was donated in 1887 in their memory, and that's Bertha, pictures of Bertha and Edith there. The Cleveland sisters' parents were Frederick Cleveland and Gertrude Van Vranken. Frederick Cleveland was born in Vermont, but his mother was a Fraley from Niskayuna, the daughter of Dr. Michael Fraley, who was the first physician in Niskayuna. Frederick met his wife Gertrude on a visit to his Fraley grandparents here. Gertrude's family, the Van Vrankens, had very deep roots here in Niskayuna. They had lived here since the 1600s. The Clevelands were married here at the Niskayuna Reformed Church in 1863. In fact, as it was very much the common practice in those days to hold marriages in the parsonage, because marriage is not a sacrament in the Dutch Reformed Church, it's just a ceremony. The Cleveland's marriage is actually the first marriage I can find that took place within this sanctuary in 1863. All the others were either done at the home of the bride or the groom or in the parsonage. Frederick Cleveland was an entrepreneur, and he traveled all over the country working in many different occupations, including running a lumber mill outside of New Orleans, Louisiana, and he barely escaped Confederate forces trapped down there at the beginning, almost trapped down there at the beginning of the Civil War. During the Civil War, he moved to Illinois, and after failing at several businesses, he developed a baking soda recipe with his wife and began marketing it with great success in the Chicago area about 1870. Cleveland was so successful that his competitors bought him out in 1871 for $500,000, which was a lot of money back then, with the provision that he would no longer make or sell baking powder in the state of Illinois. So he moves to Albany in March 1871 and establishes Cleveland's Superior Baking Powder, which is right there. Hopefully I'm not standing in front of it. And the business became successful beyond their wildest expectations. Frederick built a large new home on the newly laid out Van Rensselaer Boulevard in North Albany and christened it Grey Ledge. And that's Grey Ledge over there on your right. The Cleveland family enjoyed prosperity at Albany and were especially proud of their new home. But on Saturday, May 6th, 1882, their youngest child, Edith, suddenly became ill with fever and nausea. Doctors were called and diagnosed malignant diphtheria. But despite their best efforts, Edith died on May 10th. Less than 6 months later, Edith's older sister, Bertha, suddenly became ill as well. This time, 3 doctors were called in, but Bertha too died in a few days. Less than a week after Bertha's death, a 3rd daughter came down with the same illness of diphtheria, and doctors advised the family to evacuate the home. The family spent the winter in Albany, where doctors worked to save the life of the 3rd daughter, and they were finally successful. The family returned to Grayledge in the spring, and although the home had been thoroughly renovated, Mrs. Cleveland remained extremely nervous that the source of her children's illness had not been discovered. Frederick Cleveland bottled a sample of the well water, and a lab report showed that it was tainted with sewage. Apparently, workers who had installed an addition to the home in previous years had damaged a waste pipe, letting the sewage seep into the well. So they corrected that. In the years following, the Clevelands continued to live at Grayledge, but Frederick Cleveland began a long descent into invalidism, spending his last years in a wheelchair. He died in 1897. Gertrude died in 1918, and Grayledge was demolished for a housing development in the 1960s. We can come back, move away from back to the church here. And that alcove that used to be there, in 1902, they decided to put in a new organ. The previous organ had been this little pump reed organ that was located up in the balcony. And so in 1902, they decided to put in a full pipe organ purchased from J.W. Steers of Springfield, Massachusetts. It was installed in the alcove, shoving the pulpit out further, and then they put in a choir gallery over in the corner to the right of the pulpit. And the big other change you can see in this picture is by 1911, they have wired the church for electricity. The previous church that had oil lamps, quite a few of them. I know my great-grandfather was the sexton in the oil lamp era, and it seemed like every month he was going out and buying more glass chimneys for the oil lamps. They apparently were given to a lot of breakage. So the electricity was probably a big improvement. In 1927, Reverend Ditmars noted that as the decorations have been dulling and the audience room growing shabbier every year, we at last made up our minds to arise and refurnish and beautify this house of God. So they took the previous church, the church that was here, and they installed new hardwood floors, a new ceiling, new pews, a new platform for the pulpit and the choir, new wainscoting and decoration, new lighting and heating system, and essentially made it a brand new building inside. So while the outside of this building is from 1852, the interior here that we sit in is mostly from 1927, 1928. That they replaced pretty much everything. The Reverend Ditmars retired in 1929, and he died in 1930. The new minister, Reverend Vandermel, oversaw another remodeling of the inside front of the church. So he took what was there, you see right there, and changed it to that, which looks very familiar because it's right there behind the screen. And this was all done. The organ pipes were covered with a new screen and a stained glass window placed there. A new platform for the pulpit and the choir was installed, and they went to a pulpit and lectern system and moved the communion table up to the wrong place. And all of this was dedicated in May of 1931 as a memorial to Reverend Ditmars. However, Reverend Vandermel, he was an individual. You can ask Norm about him. He had certain problems with secretiveness, with the consistory, over the way the memorial was financed, even though it turned out that it was all donated. This all was paid for by donations from other ministers in the area as a tribute to Reverend Ditmars. The way Reverend Vandermel sort of handled it, he did it all himself without telling anybody, and there were certain cost overruns, and this led to, well, bitter recriminations between Vandermel and the consistory, and he departed in October 1931. So after this point, they replaced the pipe organ in 1958 with an electronic organ, and they did you can see here in this photo, which is about 1940, they have different pews. We replaced all the pews in 1972. and the church was listed on the National Register of Historic Places in 1978. That one, and then this one. So for more than 260 years, the Niskayuna Reformed Church has essentially remained a vibrant entity built on the foundation of its founders' faith and a belief in a continuing ministry in this community that has stretched from the colonial era to the present day. And I thank you very much for paying attention, coming see us today for this program. I shouldn't ask this, but are there any questions? Uh-oh. Yep. Good. Somebody.
The early picture showed no panel there of Jesus. So when was
Oh,
that
they
stained
hadn't put it in.
glass?
Yeah, the picture I showed you here was, come on, one more back. There it is. That was a newspaper clipping at the time they installed it. They hadn't gotten, the stained glass window was made by Chapman Art Studios, who were in Albany, and it was a little delayed. So they didn't install it right away, so it was just sort of a plain empty panel for a while until they got the window up. They also, Chapman Studios then also made the window that's downstairs in the lower hallway of the education building, which is a memorial to the Pepper family. That used to be in the old church hall, and Chapman Stained Glass also made that in the 1950s. Cindy, I think, has a question. Is that, you want me to just walk? You want to just take this and get back?
I thought maybe I could talk loud enough.
Well, the people watching will want to hear your
Okay,
question.
my question is, I saw a house, I think it was Reverend Dittmar's house. Did that have a mansard roof? Are you an architectural person?
I am. Where were we? Well, we'll go back. It might be faster to exit this and come back in.
But a mansard roof was very unusual.
That house is the one you're talking
yes,
about?
that
Okay,
looks
that was the Cleveland's house on Van Rensselaer Boulevard that they built in 1871. And that does have a mansard roof and a tower. Yeah.
Well, the only reason I asked, the house I grew up in was built in 1840. And it had a roof very similar to that.
Right. This style is called French. Oh, yeah. It was essentially invented in France, in Paris, because there were restrictions on the height of the building as the buildings were. Paris was rebuilt by Napoleon at the beginning of the 19th century. There were restrictions on the occupied height of buildings in Paris. And so the architects discovered that if they made this roof-like structure, they could get a full extra story in a building, but that was not qualified as a regular story, but yet it was tall enough for living space. And so this was a way to get it. This was developed in a way to get around the building regulations in Paris, but it then became a sort of a fashionable style here in North America and all over the place. Okay, that's probably much more than you wanted
Then
to know,
I'll
too.
ask for Norm when it's his turn to answer questions.
Anybody have a question for Norm?
Yes.
I just I have not a cold.
Well,
I remember coming home and saying to Scott, I don't like John Calvin. I love his music. I wonder why I'm here. And to this day, I have this really
well,
mediocre feeling
there's
about John.
some things I remember about Calvin, and a lot I don't. But he was Swiss, and he was educated as a lawyer, and so he was. But he was also a churchman, and that's how he developed into the theologian. By all reports, he was a very difficult personality. the people of, I think it was Geneva. He was in Basel originally, and Basel, by the way, is a very nice city. But Geneva was where he was serving, I believe, as minister of the church and so on. And he wanted to make Geneva into a theocracy, which means that God rules, everything is done through the church and so on and so forth. And they had all kinds of rules and regulations. Mm-hmm.
We played a concert there and it happened to be pouring rain. So everybody was carrying their instruments up on this long, skinny stage. There was not stage, a staircase. And we got inside the church. Every window, every stained glass window was ordered to be taken down by John Calvin.
Yes, because
to this
it
day-
had been a Catholic church, and they took Scott said the reason the panes of glass in Reformed churches were clear so God's light could shine in. They were also clear so that you could see where the world was that you were to go out to and work as a Christian in the world. And it's, we were talking earlier, I said it's too bad they did that here. It'd be much nicer if they were playing. But anyway, John Calvin didn't get along with everybody. They actually kicked him out of Geneva. And then they found they couldn't live
Things got out of control.
after things got real bad. And then they discovered about 5-6 years later they couldn't live without him, so they brought him back. And one of the other interesting things that I always thought about John Calvin, for those who became Puritans, he got paid in beer. So that's what they did in those days. But these two can probably tell you more about Calvin than me, because it's a long time ago that I studied John Calvin. So.
There's not the church and state, and we think of the separation thereof in terms of how things got out of control in Geneva. And so then and we can also look to Kierkegaard, that talked about when even the cows are holy. Then there's a thing that happens in Christian community that we see as a constant struggle today, is that then people become very judgmental and condemning, right? And so then we start making these legalistic rules for each other, and then we start burning people at the stakes and calling them witches. And so there's some horrible things that happened in Geneva that was like, whoa, this is not what God would want for us. But the other thing about John Calvin is that when you read his writings, which are extensive because he wrote. There's no extensive. He wrote a lot, and there's lots of really beautiful things that we take out of Calvin, which is why the Dutch church and the Presbyterian church have still claimed John Calvin, because he was so inspirational. But then a lot of times people take those writings and then apply them, and so Calvinism often becomes an ism when we take especially what he said about predestination and double predestination. So there's things that people take out of Calvin that he probably didn't mean, and so then so it's that way always, right, with historical figures, that there's the intention or the wondering or the pondering, and then others come and take that, oh, that's how it is. So only God knows. But I was going to go back to what Norm was saying. The other thing was to distinguish between, because again, they were seeking to reform the church. They never intended to leave it. So it was to distinguish between what had become massive idolatry. And so at that time, they were getting rid of a lot of the different icons that were perceived as having become idols, because there was the sale of indulgences and of the, it would be and again, you have to remember that the Roman Catholic Church had its own Reformation, so a lot of the things did eventually change. It just took a long time. And so, but the idols, it would be like the praying to certain people for certain things and paying certain money to get your relatives out of hell and that sort of thing, that the Protestants were saying none of that, protesting those practices. So then it was that their worship spaces were much more simple because of that, because we wanted to distinguish between that. But then as you see over the years, we start to bring the symbolism back in because we've forgotten the meaning of it, and so now we need to be reminded. Like when you look here, most Reformed churches have in it some of the original Hebrew and Greek to remind us of the Alpha and the Omega. God is the first and the last. And that IHS is actually or Yoda, Eta, Sigma, the first three letters for Jesus, Jesus. So symbolism is still important to us, but just over time how history goes back and forth.
And Calvin was a lawyer, so his writings are written like a lawyer. And so, you know, you present the case and then you argue both sides and so on and so forth. And if you want to read them, I'll give you my copies.
I think we might have gotten rid of ours too.
I still have mine. Yeah, nobody's.
Lots of audiobooks, I'm sure.
Anybody else?
Norm, I don't know if you can answer this or not, but I decided to ask it. So now that we're going through, I won't call it another reform, but a different stage in our church's life, what can we use from our past to help us go forward with this new way of looking at the world, more all-inclusive?
That's probably a question I can't answer. The world changes, obviously. What used to be bad in the past is now not so bad. My daughter is marrying a woman in June, and I will do the wedding. So, you know, things change. But I think it goes back to that we believe that all people are the people of God and that God made them the way they are and that we accept them for who they are and what they are and not say that that's all sinful and bad. You know, in Great Britain, up until, I don't know when it was, the 60s or 70s, homosexuality was punishable by prison. And you know, things change. Going back to Calvin, they began to have such petty restrictions that it was terrible. You could hardly walk down Sunday. You could not walk down the street probably. So that's why they threw him out. But I don't know, Rick, if I answered your question, but we'll see. But I don't know. And there's a lot of turmoil in the country and in the church these days. And where it's going to come out, we don't know at this point. So.
I would say to that, Rick, that a lot of what Norm described as Reformed theology as a part of why it's lasted is that it does transcend time in the sense of always reforming according to the Word of God. And so as we understand God's lens in community and the Holy Spirit continuing to speak in us and through us, that we're always seeking to reform together, so whatever that means. But we know that a part of what it means is around word and sacrament, and that we continue to see, oops, we messed up again. We're still guilty by nature, and God's grace is still sufficient for us that we can live a life of gratitude.
And I would just add myself, so I'll speak. But yeah, right. I think it's a great question. The thing that's just spurring in me is to recognize that history and today, like everything has a context. I think that's what I would say. So as we look at the past, even if we look at Scripture, we say, what is going on in the time period for the people? What are they trying to deal with as a way of helping them understand? So we don't make these blanket, oh, this is for all time and all places statements of things we learn. Okay, what's the context? How do we do this well? And to recognize that God is faithful and we're human in every context. And so what do we learn from the past? To me, it's just the importance of what's the context is an important question of looking at our history and looking at what we're called to in the present as well.
during the Civil War, the Methodist Church, the Presbyterian Church, the Lutheran Church, the Baptist Church split. There was the Southern Methodist, the Southern, and the Northern. They all reunited except the Baptist. Did the Reformed Church split?
Not that I'm aware of. Can you speak to that?
I can say that, no, I mean, the Dutch Reformed Church is mostly located in the Northeast and was even then. However, it was divided on the subject of slavery. There, I mean, in all these places in the Northeast, of course, there had been slaveholders in these congregations. And so there were churches who were divided over the question of whether the federal government had was able to, eliminate slavery. So you get in the 1850s, right? You get up here, Congress passing the Fugitive Slave Laws, which meant that slaves that had escaped into free states people could come up and take them and remove them back into slave states. Now, there were a lot of places in New England where the government of Massachusetts stood up and said, we are not going to enforce the Fugitive Slave Law, right? In New York, there were places that were divided, where there were there were areas and churches and the Dutch Reformed Church that said, no, this is the law of the land. We're going to support, these people that come up and enforce this terrible law. And there were other congregations that didn't. And there were divisions within a congregation as well. Very much like our congregation today has people on one side of the political divide and people on the other side of the political divide. We somehow meet here in this building in the middle, but there are still the same kind of divisions. That
I mean, I understand. I just wondered whether, do I believe that we should ever support slavery? It doesn't matter. But and to your point, the places like in New York and Pennsylvania that didn't believe in the fugitive slave laws tended to be Quakers. I mean, the Quakers were they didn't care. They'd kill you if you tried to take tried to take slaves away.
The unique thing that's related to the Dutch history, the crest of the Reformed Church in America, the Dutch saying on the bottom, "En dracht macht macht," which I used to absolutely hate as a female in ministry, but in unity brings strength. And the essence of that was this sense that we can be divided in perspective, but we are united in Christ. And so the Dutch Reformed has always had this strange history of being able to hold tension over different issues, so that the church as a whole, which has gotten us into a lot of trouble, and in terms of inner turmoil of what does it mean to hold tension. But so there again, in the history of some of that I know from some of the other churches farther west, we're part of the Underground Railroad, and those were Dutch Reformed churches, and so there again, there's this strange mix in the history.
I've heard that really, and this was from one of the chief historians in Pennsylvania, the only churches that really supported the Underground Railroad were the Quakers and the Methodists. Everybody else, it's just myth. I mean, but the Quakers, obviously, they were totally supportive.
There were a lot of places that supported it quietly. I mean, every congregation is different. Some congregations did, some congregations didn't. I will point out that defying the fugitive slave law is against the law. It's a crime that is punishable by imprisonment. And so, quite frankly, you don't make a big deal if you are helping fugitive slaves escape, right? Because it's illegal. And so, so there is not a lot of documentation left on whether, let's say, this congregation helped fugitive slaves escape or they didn't. Because if you did, you didn't say much about it because it's against the law, right? So there's the Quakers as a whole are sort of much more vocal about defying the law than perhaps some other people.
I was in a Quaker temple,
Right.
or whatever they call it, meeting house, and I was talking to them about, I said something about the Underground Railroad, and they said, which one? Because they are currently running an Underground Railroad, which boggles the mind. I also, I went in there and they have the dividing walls, women on one side, men on the other, and I asked them about it, and they said it was to allow women to speak their voice and not be known who was speaking their voice. It was really a way to support the women, which I thought was amazing. It wasn't because they were more tempted by sin.
There's also an interesting museum out just outside Ausable Chasm on the Underground Railroad. And they have a display of the different churches that split, like Southern Methodist, Northern Methodist, Southern Baptist, and have little church buildings. You open doors and let the museum display what they did during that time and how they reacted. Question back here?
I just have general questions from a few of members who have come through our door today, and they came to see our church, and they would like to, I've invited them to see the upstairs. So I want everyone to know the balcony, you can walk upstairs. I don't believe the basement will be open. I have had a question about that. People are very intrigued to learn all they can about, which is great. But I will leave that up to our pastors to make that decision. I don't know if we're going down there.
You don't want to see the basement.
Okay.
For one thing is almost everybody who walks down those stairs hits their head. And so that we're going to say that's a liability issue.
Yeah.
And you don't want to climb up into the attic either because the stairs are...
But we'll send up one of our volunteers from our committee upstairs to answer any questions up there. So we'll do that now.
Yep, we will say thank you very much, and we will stay and answer any questions if you want. But I think we want to